Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast. And today we're excited to be sitting down with one of Preservation Maryland and Smart Growth Maryland's own, Briana Paxton. And we're going to be talking all about her work and the work she does with us, the work she's done previous to us, her path to preservation and smart growth and revitalization and all that good stuff, and what you should know about smart growth and why preservationists should care about this issue and how it can complement our work. But before we get there, we like to get to know folks. So, Bree, where did you grow up, and when did you realize that you were going to work in preservation?
I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and I was actually homeschooled growing up until 9th grade. So Mom did a really great job of taking us on field trips all over the place. And I really loved all of our field trips to historic sites, like going to Monticello or the Stanton Frontier Culture Museum as a living history museum was like my favorite. And then I had an internship with my town of Woodstock in high school. And that really kind of solidified for me. It's like, I think I want to work in an old town someplace. So I always thought I would do kind of town planning. But then as I went through college and on to grad school, I really got into advocacy and how that impacts local development. And that really led me down the path of like, yep, I'm a historic preservationist with a capital P.
And where did you go to school for preservation? Did you go to school for planning? What was the schooling background?
Yeah, I went to College of William Mary for undergrad, and I ended up designing my own degree. We called it the Study of the Built Environment. And I did my undergrad thesis on a neighborhood in Williamsburg called Braxton Court, which is a 1930s era development developed by African Americans, several of whom were bricklayers for colonial Williamsburg. And the advocacy piece of it was that it's not listed on the National Register. And a similar era neighborhood that was kind of the White Street, also associated with people who had worked at colonial Williamsburg, was on the National Register. So that really kind of got me into thinking like, what gets listed and why, and like who is making those choices. So I really went off to grad school at UPenn in Philly with that in mind, really kind of angry at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation for this like beautiful 18th century town that they preserved, but like the history of other eras wasn't looked at with and advocated for the same. And then in grad school, I ended up hitting it off with one of my professors, Donovan Ripkema, and ended up working at his consulting firm, Place Economics, for the next 8 years, where I traveled all across the country, sometimes internationally, looking at the economic impact of historic preservation, developing incentives for historic preservation, and meeting with developers and preservationists all across the country that were doing the work.
Yeah, and I feel like that's where we first got to know you. And it's sort of an amazing track record that firm has put together and the places it's studied and the work that it's done. For people not familiar with place economics or even just sort of economic analysts, how would you describe that work? Do you have like an example or like maybe a favorite project that you worked on?
One of my favorite projects was probably what we call a catalytic impact study. And all those studies, you use historic district boundaries or historic buildings versus non-historic buildings. It's a lot of GIS mapping, which I'd done in undergrad. And you use a lot of tax assessment data and census data and any city permitting data that you can get your hands on. And you really kind of just compare and contrast like historic buildings, non-historic buildings, new construction, rehab, and just look for patterns. And the project in New Orleans I really loved was a catalytic impact of the O.C. Haley Boulevard. There was a nonprofit developer that had been very strategically investing on that boulevard, which is kind of north of the Garden District in New Orleans. And they had a big housing focus. They're building a lot of new housing, but they were also rehabbing buildings using the tax credits. And it was pretty impressive to see the transformation along that boulevard with just bringing more people. Now storefronts are being filled with businesses and people can walk to those businesses. And so it's all the revitalization stats that you would envision are happening were happening on that boulevard. And it was catalyzed by all this tax credit funded rehab by this nonprofit.
Yeah, and so it's kind of putting the data behind all of that. And I feel like the thing that economic analysis, whether it be done by a group like Place Economics or others, brings is for the advocate, which makes total sense that you were interested in advocacy, because for the advocate, it provides a tool to make the case for those who perhaps aren't persuaded by history or social stories or the value of place. They're just driven by dollars and cents. Then you can really hit them over the head with that. And it's interesting. I think sometimes it swings too far in one way or the other. Sometimes it's an argument without data, and then sometimes it's so data driven that it just gets cold. And it's like, what are we even doing? So it's, you really kind of have to figure out where that argument should be. But it's a powerful tool.
That is one thing I learned from Don Ripkema is that he always said, you never know how people learn words, pictures, or numbers. So you always want to have all of those in a report, because some people are just going to flip through and look at the pictures and be totally sold. Other people are going to look through the numbers, and no matter what you tell them, they might, not agree with the methodology and not look at it. But other people are going to be moved by the words and the whole culmination of it. So making sure you always have words, pictures, and numbers to tell your story. And doing the data analysis is one thing. I think the storytelling aspect of putting those reports together is also vitally important. And then you also need to have the grassroots advocates on the ground who are going to take that report and share it with the decision makers or share it with the people that need to be influenced to help, move a program forward or actually implement an incentive or change a decision. So, we've all seen the reports that just get put on a shelf. And I think a lot of times the economic impact reports and tax credit reports that Place Economics does, they're so well designed for the general reader that they do get used. Not that more academic reports aren't worthy in preservation. We certainly love those, and I love digging into those every year. It's just, that's for a different review. If, your Senate Finance Committee is reviewing that, and then you want the hard numbers. But if it's, your run-of-the-mill small town council person that you're trying to influence, then it probably needs to be a little bit more readable for the general public.
Yeah, we'll have to do another episode with you, words, pictures, and numbers, and then we'll just talk about what makes a good report so people can put those together. So, most people listening probably know that PreserveCast is we say it's powered by Preservation Maryland, and one of Preservation Maryland's programs is called Smart Growth Maryland, which is the result of a merger. There's a long story there. We don't need to get into all that, but we were very purposeful in being focused and dedicated to this work because we see a real overlap, particularly in a state like Maryland, that prides itself on smart growth. Perhaps even the term originated here in Maryland. You could make that argument. And it is a place where we desperately need it because we're not a big state and we have to be wise in our use of resources. And so we have hired a revitalization policy analyst who is Bree, and she has filled that role ably and is doing some really cool research and work to try and support communities across our state in doing this. And so I guess maybe the first question I would ask is, like, from the perspective of somebody who is unfamiliar with smart growth and perhaps has a preservation or just an affinity for history background, why should they care about smart growth? They like old buildings. What could this possibly have to do with them?
Well, I think for Maryland, as the ninth smallest state and the gateway to the Chesapeake Bay, it's super important. Maryland's done a great job, as you mentioned, being a leader in smart growth back in the 90s when it was first, came to fruition and was popularized. And, it's based on 10 principles. Some are around, mixed land uses, compact building, walkable communities, preserving open space, strengthening existing communities, variety of transportation, and encouraging stakeholder collaboration and decision. So it's all a lot of grassroots oriented views that I think we share in preservation. You can't establish a historic district without grassroots support and talking to property owners and building those decisions from the ground up. So I think it shares a lot of its philosophy with preservation in that sense. And also many of the communities that could be labeled as a smart growth community are historic, probably built pre-1940, pre-World War II, right? So I know one of our taglines is always that preservation was the original smart growth, which I think is true to a certain extent. I think now that we're listing ranch subdivisions as historic districts, we might need to rethink some of those historic resources that were created during the time of sprawl, and how to sensitively densify those could be a question for us in the future. But I think Maryland as a state has done a tremendous job with smart growth policy, being kind of the main planning philosophy for many years. With priority funding areas is certainly something that you don't always see in other states. And I'm really excited about the new legislation, the Just Communities Act, which is kind of continuing on down the funnel of PFAs, priority funding areas, to designate just communities that are communities that have been historically disinvested in, and prioritizing state funding in those districts with an equity lens, which is certainly another way that Maryland is leading the charge on equity investments.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, that's obviously the Maryland perspective. You take this global perspective, whether you have PFAs, which is basically catchment areas where the state is or isn't going to send their state dollars for infrastructure and other types of improvements, grants, and things like that. But no matter where you are, but particularly if you're here in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, growing within existing communities, whether they be historic or whether they be legacy, whether they, just sort of existing space, using existing space better is always a good place to start, rather than chewing up a farm field or a forest. And that's where I feel like environmentalism and preservation can really come together in a good way, in that, historic communities, just because of the nature of demolition and things that have been lost over time, they have a lot of empty lots in them from time to time. And figuring out ways to incentivize infill is critically important. And I feel like should be a call and a charge for the preservation community as well. But I'm curious what you think about that. And I know you just published a blog on sort of like these barriers to infill, and infill being a big part of the conversation when it comes to preservation and smart growth. Talk to us a little bit about infill and what are the barriers, and perhaps not just the barriers, but like what can preservationists do to be better about attracting or incentivizing infill?
Absolutely. I think that one of the main barriers to infill is perception that it's hard to do. And some of that is based in reality, but some of it's not. Some people are more comfortable and consider greenfield development like easier. But it's like, if you have to add infrastructure and build new roads and stuff like that, that to me is more complicated than building on an existing street and tapping into an existing sewer line. But oftentimes in many communities across America and in Maryland, zoning restrictions, which are still stuck in, let's say, sprawl type zoning, prevent you from building what is next door. And that can be pretty frustrating, and it makes the lots sometimes unusable, or there's too many hoops to jump through. You have to go get a variance to be able to build on this lot. That can be a deterrent for people. And I think right now, a lot of places are also struggling with community opposition. Change is scary to people. And certainly, if they've looked at this vacant lot and it's never been built on before, suddenly having a house there can seem threatening to people. What do these changes mean to me? And certainly, I think the classic gentrification vision of like a single family house, all these little houses next to some giant, 5-story 501 building, which gets built everywhere, that is very scary to people. So they say no to things because they don't want this slippery road of like, suddenly there's an American Apparel and a Starbucks in an apartment building next door to us, and this is a single family neighborhood. And that sounds scary. So I think with infill, starting small is important, and just making incremental zoning changes to allow you to build what is existing and compatible in your environment is the number one thing people can do.
And do you think that that's where the mistake is made on, and we're not going to call out any specific places, but is that where the mistake is made with preservation? Can preservation stand in the way because they're concerned about these sort of cumulative effects on a neighborhood? And is the way to get around that, like you say, incrementalism? We don't have to upturn everything to make this happen, but perhaps allowing for some variances, or in some ways just allowing for things that would have naturally happened. One comes to mind is like in historic districts, the idea of ADUs in many ways is just replacing what previously often had already been lost, which is ancillary outbuildings. And many historic districts are missing those because over time, those were the ones that were easy to demolish. Seems like to me, ADUs, which is an accessory dwelling unit, sort of a little, building that sits in your backyard oftentimes, and can be an additional housing space, could be sort of a small step for some historic districts to make, with a nod towards greater housing options. But I'm curious what you think about that. Like, where have preservationists kind of gotten in their own way, and where could they get out of the way?
Yeah, I think preservationists need to do a better job of talking about the hidden density in historic districts. And pretty much every study that I was involved, citywide study that I was involved with at Place Economics, showed that residential historic districts are typically the most dense residential areas of a city, because they were usually built pre-zoning and are more compact and have these hidden, it might be looks like a single family house, but it's actually a duplex, and they have an ADU in the backyard. And those sorts of things are very difficult to build in most communities today, or illegal to build in most communities today. So I think preservationists need to be better about recognizing the density that we do have and saying, hey, these are great models. These neighborhoods work. One, we should allow that to be recreated. And two, also fighting the concept that, I'm going to use the term upzoning, which I think is very popular right now. People talk about upzoning, which often I think people think can mean, a height variance and you got to build towers to have density. But there's actually research out of Boston that showed that just allowing more flexibility in a zoning in terms of like how you position a building on a lot and how many units you can have in it garners more housing units than making a height increase. Because what happens in a lot of bigger cities is like, okay, you can build to the sky, but now they're building luxury apartments where like one floor is a whole apartment. And incentivizing people to build smaller is inherently going to be more affordable. So allowing those more incremental of like, okay, you got to stay at, 36-foot height limit or 40-foot height limit or whatever your local zoning is, but you can have flexibility to fit the mass and scale to match the neighborhood. But like, what do we care how many units are in it?
Interesting. And I think that there's a lot there for people to kind of think through, and there's a lot of detail in this work, which is I think sometimes why people shy away from it, because you really get into the nitty gritty of policy. It's one thing to advocate for a historic tax credit, which is pretty straightforward, 20% off of the rehab costs, you can kind of like make those numbers work really well. But when you start getting into this, it can get more challenging. oftentimes the way I try and explain it is when I talk about this to groups is that if you look at a historic neighborhood and you like that historic neighborhood, the reality, like you just said, so kind of picking up on something you said there, is that you couldn't probably build that today.
Mm-hmm.
Most historic communities, Savannah, Frederick, Maryland, Boston, all these different places that we've kind of referenced or talked about, you really couldn't, with current zoning, even attempt or contemplate building something like that. I live on a street where there's so many different housing types and varieties and cost points too. And this either isn't being built or can't be built. It's somewhere in between sometimes, I think. And I remember one time, not to bring up place economics again, but I remember reading in a place economics report one time that the swing between the most expensive and the least expensive home in a historic district is significantly larger than the swing between the most expensive and least expensive home in, say, like greenfield development. There, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was in the single digits. And in a historic district, it can be 100 or 200% sometimes from cheapest to most expensive, just because there's that variety of resources. And we don't build like that nowadays, and we don't build sort of this missing middle or even starter homes. I think for preservationists, they might be very familiar with historic district commissions and the challenges and the opportunities when it comes to that. But when it comes to zoning, it's something that some of us shy away from. But I think that more and more we're having to be part of these conversations, particularly if we care about growth and infill and all these sorts of things. So what is zoning? And, which I know is a big question, but kind of give us a little taste for that. And then why should the preservation community care about it? And then maybe we'll talk a little bit more about what they can do when it comes to zoning. But what is it, and why should preservationists care?
Absolutely. So zoning is enforced at the local level, and most municipalities have some form of zoning. Houston, of course, is one city that's famous for no zoning, or very lax zoning. But it was established around 1916. New York City was the first municipality in the country with a zoning code. And it basically dictated what could be built where and what types of structures could be built where. And by 1917, just a little history of zoning here, it was already being used in many cities across the country to exclude certain groups of people. So in 1917, there's a famous Supreme Court case, Buchanan versus Worley in Lexington, Kentucky, where a white man tried to sell a house to a black man, and it was blocked because the local ordinance said that this was a majority white block and you could not allow a black person to live there. So this went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said you can't have a local ordinance dictating where people can live based on race, but if you link it to public welfare, then you're okay. So that's like concerning on one level there. Then about 10 years later, in 1926, there was Euclid, Ohio versus Ambler Realty Company. So it was another Supreme Court case dealing with real estate law. And that one further enforced that local zoning ordinances were good. But it said that basically you had to link it to public welfare, and that you could dictate residential could be over here and industrial could be over here. But it kind of continued to be used to exclude. And then came the concept of redlining in 1934, when the federal government really got involved with segregating real estate. So since then, this concept of local zoning, and particularly the concept of single family zoning, which back then was endorsement to mean white single family home ownership, was kind of put on this pedestal of like, this is the best type of residential land use, and things like apartments were bad. And so a lot of places in the country, you start seeing single family neighborhoods pop up in the early 1930s. Fast forward to now, we're in a housing crisis. The number of single family households or single person households are increasing. The number of baby boomers that need smaller houses are increasing, but we're still only allowed to build in most municipalities a lot of single family properties. So this is a big problem nationally and something that the National Zoning Atlas has really called attention to. And work is underway in Maryland right now, particularly around the Baltimore region, to kind of analyze these local zoning ordinances and find out how much property is allowed to be built single family versus multifamily. So places like Connecticut and Montana have already completed this analysis, and they're really using it to highlight how much space is dedicated to single family. So that was a very long answer of asking, why do preservationists care? It's because many historic districts and walkable neighborhoods that we see today and we love and we want to preserve are walkable neighborhoods that actually have a lot of hidden density in them. And they were probably built pre-sprawly zoning codes. And that's really important for us to preserve that character, but it's also important for us to care that we can rebuild these neighborhoods that we love. Like, I'm in Savannah, Georgia, and much of our zoning code doesn't allow us to rebuild the type of built environment that we're so famous for. And it's just kind of like, how do we tweak this to make it so that we can, have row houses again in many places across the country?
I'm curious. You hear a lot about eliminating single-family zoning, and that is a goal of some housing advocates. And I think you make a compelling case for the challenges associated with single-family zoning. From the preservation standpoint, I hear preservationists who perhaps aren't as familiar with zoning and are a little bit confused or concerned about it. Should they be worried about the elimination of single-family zoning? Does that pose a threat to historic districts in general, or just certain types of them? How can that be addressed? What does that do with a historic district? I'm just curious, from your perspective and the work that you've done, what do you think about that?
I think it can be a threat to historic districts. I think it's both sides of the fence. I think preservationists sometimes, rightly or wrongly, get thrown into being NIMBYs, like not in my backyard, because they don't want to change anything. So I think in that sense, we need to be better about talking about the types of hidden density that are in historic districts, that there's probably duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes and ADUs in your backyard that might be illegal to build today. So it's important that we have those historic districts to protect that housing stock that you couldn't rebuild today. So we definitely need to be loud about that. But we also need to be loud about making sure that if we are tweaking zoning regulations, that it is not, there's a time and place for density with like super tall buildings, but I think people get scared when it's like a, 2 or 3 story type neighborhood. And then suddenly there's just like 5/1 apartment buildings being built next to it. So I think that's everyone's vision and everyone's scare. But there's got to be ways to, with form-based codes and stuff nowadays to step up to that, or just, again, add more density at a lower scale. There's actually some research out of Boston that showed that they got more units of housing, not by allowing a height increase, but just being more flexible in what and how many units could be built on a property. Like, if you can fit the massing and scale that matches the neighborhood, why do we care how many units are on that property?
And, I think this is an audio podcast, so you can't see this, but I sort of smiled when Bree said form-based code, because I actually wrote down in my notes, ask about form-based code when you were saying this, because, when you're talking about the concern around, what do they call them, like fourplexes or whatever, or eightplexes or what, those things that you see being built everywhere. And that sometimes that's the concern, not so much about the actual end use. And so is form-based code a big opportunity? Because it seems to me like it is, and I feel like it's a good way to blend new and old. But maybe you can talk about what it is and why preservationists should take a look at it, because I don't think a lot of preservationists are talking about form-based code.
I think depending on the municipality, form-based code is starting to be integrated, and it is a zoning code that really specifies more on the scale and massing and setbacks of a property, and usually doesn't address things like materials or cladding. And so really, usually they have great diagrams of kind of like, you could fit this mass right here. And that, that would fit the zoning code. So some of it takes the math out of like, oh, can I fit this building on this property? Makes it a little easier just to be like, oh, I have this much flexibility within the zoning code to build up. And I think it can work well in historic districts, but the other important key thing to remember around local planning is that the more specific element of your plan trumps the other. So historic district overlay, which typically has more specific guidelines on materials or massing or tree canopies and stuff like that, is more specific than the form-based code zoning. And so many communities get a little frustrated about like, oh, if these two pieces of code are in conflict, like did some work in Beaufort, South Carolina, and they had this struggle of like, which part of the code do we look at for what? And I think the one thing, it takes a strong preservation staff and a strong preservation commission to say, yes, we understand that the zoning allows you to build to this and to that, but inside the historic district, we have more restrictions and you can actually only build to here and build to there. And maybe you have to have a porch and a couple of other elements like that to maintain the character of the district. So they can work in tandem, but you got to cross-reference pretty carefully. So if you're in a historic community and you're trying to do form-based code, I would just make sure whoever's writing it really is cross-referencing all of those parts of the code to make sure that communities aren't getting stuck in, which part, takes precedence.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And I'm glad you brought up form-based code though, because we probably could do a whole other episode on that with a form-based code expert. But, I think that there's a lot of promise there, particularly when they're matched with a pattern book sometimes, or can be used for infill, in that, like you said, it sort of prescribes a process and takes some of the guesswork out of it. And if you can line up all those things and have all your ordinances kind of match and explain and show how they flow, I feel like there is potential for it. And my understanding is with form-based code, it takes out the question oftentimes about what is going in that building, and it's more about what the building looks like and its massing, not so much and its location in relationship to the street and things like that, and not so much about we don't want this type of housing, or we don't want, or it can't be commercial. It allows for a lot more organic and natural development of community space versus prescriptive, sort of that Euclidean style where, everything is in its separate zone.
I think it starts at like the wide end of the funnel of just like, okay, how big can we build to match the character of the area? And as you, the developer, property owner, going down, getting more narrow in the funnel, then you get down to, okay, what uses are allowed in this zoning district? And obviously some of it's like, well, you wouldn't build a round bowling alley. So some of those things have to talk to each other. But
that could be really fun. I think you may have just stumbled on a new game, round bowling.
A new gig, how to design a round bowling alley. But yeah, I think they definitely can work together. And I think those questions of like what uses are appropriate for what area and what uses are appropriate for what building type is all very localized and varies community to community.
So speaking of communities, in your community, you mentioned it, Savannah, Georgia, you recently had the opportunity to give a TED Talk. So you literally had the opportunity to say, welcome to my TED Talk, which is very cool. I hope you did. And it had a lot to do with some of the topics we're talking about today. We'll drop a link in the show notes so people can, if you're not getting enough of Bri in this episode, you can dial in and get a little bit more, because she has a lot of really cool things to say and a lot of knowledge, and awareness about these issues, which is why we're so excited to be talking with her today and to have her on our team. But talk to us a little bit about your Savannah TEDx talk and what that focused in on.
Absolutely. So there's many chapters throughout the country, but Savannah TEDx Savannah has a license to put on a TED event annually, and they've done that for a number of years. And I applied. It's like a written pitch, and then we had a in-person pitch, and they selected 12 of us from there. So it was a good cohort. Our topic this year was convergence. And I ended up presenting research that had started a few years earlier. I had actually a while ago done a Instagram takeover for an Instagram account called Legalize Housing, which is a group out of Cincinnati that they basically go around and just show photos of like duplexes, triplexes, eightplexes that are illegal to build in Cincinnati and just call awareness to them. So I did one on my neighborhood, Baldwin Park in Savannah, where there's fourplexes that are illegal to build. And I think that's kind of stupid. So when I started going down and doing this research, I realized when I looked back at our redlining maps and our current zoning that a lot of the lines matched up. And my research led me down realizing that areas of town where white property ownership was prioritized 100 years ago were still zoned single family only. And oftentimes they have duplexes and triplexes in them. But today our zoning is more restrictive and you can't build that. And areas of town that were redlined, like our Yamacraw neighborhood, which is just west of downtown Savannah, don't exist anymore because they were demolished. They were redlined in the 1930s, demolished in the 1940s, or later through various federal initiatives. Savannah's redlining also has a really fascinating point where local advocates, and it says in the redlining documents that local advocates lobbied to have some of the grades changed. So there's actually 2 historically Black neighborhoods in Savannah that were not redlined. They were upgraded because local people said, hey, these are actually like really great neighborhoods where there was a lot of existing Black home ownership. And so one was labeled yellow and one was actually labeled green. Kind of Brownville was labeled green. And that's something that's kind of unique in the redlining documents. For those that are curious out there and haven't seen redlining documents for your city, there are many of them that are online in the National Archives. It's called the City Files, if you search for that. But the University of Richmond in Virginia has the Mapping Inequality Project, and they have digitized many of the cities in the U.S. And that was kind of what led me on to this research in the first place. Was you can download a GIS layer of your zoning map. You can click through and read the descriptions of each neighborhood. And that's what kind of led me down a lot of this research.
Wow. I mean, that is, and I feel like there's a lot that we could unpack there. We probably could do an entire episode, which might be kind of interesting, just on that talk and on that research. But, you mentioned that the modern map matched up in many ways with the redlining map. Was that something popularly known? Were people aware of that in Savannah? Was the planning team aware of that, or was everybody a little surprised?
I think people were a little surprised. Part of my talk was I wanted to show the archival evidence of like, here's the map, here's the descriptions that were written in very inflammatory, discriminatory language. Like, I feel like a lot of people like don't know the extent to how pervasive this discrimination was and how hard it was for people of color to own a home. So I really wanted to show the, archival evidence. And I also really wanted to have a call to action of saying, hey, this shouldn't be acceptable anymore. We should fix it. So I talked about that we need to listen to the families impacted by redlining and hear their experiences. And I know a lot of people want to kind of skip that step and be like, let's just get to the solutions. I'm like, no, let's sit with the uncomfortable and let that inform our solutions. So this is kind of the advocate in me that I couldn't really turn off, is like, I wanted to use my privilege on this TEDx stage to like tell this story. And it's actually been really fascinating to engage with people about this, because I've had someone come up and tell me that neighborhood really was a slum. It needed to be demolished. And in Savannah, the main neighborhood that got demolished was Yamacraw. And there's actually one church still left that didn't get demolished, First Bryan Baptist Church. And it actually recently just got a Preserving Black Churches grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So shout out to them for investing in that. But I've had another person tell me that I should be embarrassed because I had a line in my speech where I said single family, we need to eliminate single family zoning in Savannah because it's the remnants of white supremacy in the built environment. And I don't mean that we shouldn't build single family homes ever. I just feel like by having districts where we can only build single family, we are still excluding people. That is, of course, the American dream, but we are at a point where that's not possible for everybody, and not everybody has a place to live. And we just need to make sure we have enough housing units for people, no matter if they're in apartments or ADUs or a single family. If we eliminate single family, I think we could provide a lot more housing opportunities at lots more price points for folks. So that was kind of my call to action, was everyone should be talking to people about this, talking to your elected officials about this. And at some point we need to come up with how would we literally change our zoning text to allow more opportunities and more housing to be built.
Yeah, and I think, as you said before, there's all of these decisions come down to what's best for a locality, listening to people and listening to that people in that community. And so lots of different communities are going to make lots of different decisions on that. But I think one of the things that we kind of wanted to bring to the surface here, kind of using your background and your awareness and all this, is that there are a lot of ways in which the preservation community can engage in these conversations and should be thinking about them, and that we can't shy away from it. I mean, I think Bonnie McDonald at Landmark, Illinois, makes this great case that, in order for preservation to stay relevant, she probably would say it in a much more eloquent way than I would, but she would say that we have to be part of important conversations, and we have to use the way I pitch it is we have to use historic resources to make sustainable, just, and great communities to live in. And we can do some of that. And there's some cool tools that we can all be looking at. And this is just a sort of an eye opener to some of that. This is a primer, certainly not an advanced study in that in this short time that we have here. As we kind of move to that conclusion, for the preservationist listening to this who, is an advocate, maybe works for a small organization or, works or volunteers on the Historic District Commission, what's the big takeaway that you would want them to have about sort of these smart growth infill issues, and how can they make a difference?
Well, I think first off is to, we always say the greenest building is the one already built, but in terms of our affordable housing crisis, the fastest and cheapest way to get more affordable housing is to preserve existing units and keep residents in them. I don't know if anyone's ever read the book Evicted, but having to move all the time is very destructive for your life. So one, do a lot to keep those units. Two, add more affordable units to existing buildings, either through a LIHTC program or a local incentive program, and there's many out there. And third would be to support these zoning tweaks and allow infill that's compatible, and encourage some of it to be mixed use, encourage some of it to be affordable housing, and really just try to make sure that you're doing things in those orders. I think of like preserving what we have, making sure we're using what we have, and then adding new, I think would be the chain of call to action there.
I think that's really well said. I'm like, as you're saying that, I'm like, I want to turn that into a little infographic. I think that would be a fantastic one. We'll call it the Paxton model. This has been a lot of fun and just eye-opening and always exciting to talk to somebody who's passionate about the work and who knows about the issues and has had time to kind of think about it and work in it. And we will not only have to have you back, we will have you back to talk about something in the very near future. So thanks for joining us today, Bri.
Thanks so much, Nick.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.